All right. So once again, I'm Jessica Moreno, and I'm the Conservation Science Director at the Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection. I'm a wildlife biologist by training. And along here with us, we have Brian. You want to introduce yourself really quick,
Yeah.
Brian?
Hi, folks. I'm Brian Blaze. I'm a wildlife biologist as well. Uh, and my research tends to bridge ecological and management um, concerns that address conservation challenges. And I'll be talking about one of my projects today.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get into it. Today, we're here to talk about roadkill. Uh, and this is something that's not for the faint of heart for many people, but it's a super important subject. And so hopefully most of you are already somewhat familiar with um, the concept that we've been talking about, we will be talking about here. Just for some background information, since many of you are new to us, the Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection is about 25 years old. We protect the biodiversity of the Sonoran Desert, largely in Pima County, through advocacy, education, and collaboration. We are very closely aligned with the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan and ensuring its implementation. We're also known for having gotten the Ironwood National Forest Monument designated. And today we do a lot of community science that supports our advocacy work to protect open spaces and wildlife corridors, building wildlife crossings, habitat conservation planning, and fighting off some of those bad proposals that impact those um, core issues of ours, like the I-11 freeway and mining in the Santa Ritas. So that's what we do. We work throughout Pima County, and the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan has identified where wildlife are moving across the landscape through riparian areas and washes, and also through open space as well. And so those starred areas are areas where we've been focusing a lot of our efforts on building wildlife crossing structures and helping wildlife safely cross roads. Now, knowing where those crossings go really relies on a lot of different kinds of data that we compile. And that is everything from modeling habitat use and movement of wildlife on GIS mapping software, looking at data from animals that have been collared and where they're moving across the landscape, and also roadkill and crash data. So here in this map, you can see this is an area we've been focused on for many years, north of Tucson, near Catalina State Park, connecting the Tortolita Mountains with the Catalina Mountains. And we successfully got a wildlife bridge constructed there in 2016, along with an underpass about a mile south of that. And then after that project, we started working on the area around Cienega Creek near Vale, trying to help animals cross Interstate 10 there. Davidson Canyon and Cienega Creek are a major wildlife movement thoroughway. It's also a very important wildlife corridor for black bears and also for jaguars and ocelots potentially. Um, so we were focused on that, and that involved both camera monitoring and roadkill surveys as well. We were able to map some hot spots of where we were seeing those roadkill occurrences happening and compare that to where there were existing culverts and crossing points and try to determine why animals may or may not be using those, um, and come up with recommendations to improve those existing crossing structures with retrofits, put in some wildlife funnel fencing to make sure the animals find those places, and also suggest where, like right here, we might want to put in some new structures. So all of this work is part of connecting the data with um, And I have a film here. I'm actually going to skip it and send you the links later because I think it'll save us on time. And we have this on our website. So we'll skip that and I'll hand it off to Brian in a second. But so where we are right now is that we have gaps in the data that we need in Pima County. We can pull crash records of wildlife vehicle collisions, but these are really sparse. It relies on people having made police a police report, and then also the police report stating that it was an animal collision. So they're helpful, but they're not very comprehensive. Roadkill can tell us a lot more about where animals are attempting to cross roads and failing. It can also tell us some really interesting information when we find no roadkill and we discover that that linkage is completely blocked and animals cannot use it. That can be interesting data too. So we've always been interested in this. We know we need some more data in very specific areas. And Brian here has been working on a really cool study that you started in 2018, setting up some specific transects to look at what this data can tell us in terms of the ecology of these roads, and also compare places that we want to be able to look at long term for long-term monitoring. So I'm going to pass it off to Brian, and you can talk about what we've learned so far about this study, and then what volunteers can get engaged on helping with us to continue it in the future. And then I'll wrap up at the end. So take it away, Brian. If you can, it looks like you're frozen.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay, sorry. One of us froze there for a second. Were you wrapped up, Jessica? Are you handing it off to
Yes,
me?
I'm handing off to you. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, folks. Yeah, so it started off as a side project while I was doing my dissertation at University of Arizona. Started in 2018, and some collaborators and I decided to do a road ecology study. And an ever so brief recap of road ecology. It's basically looking for wildlife on roads, but a lot of studies around the world tend to focus on habitats that are more tropical. They tend to focus on larger animals or single species, such as deer or mountain lion, bears, and things like that. And also, they tend to focus on highways and really high traffic roads. Where my study differs is that we're obviously working in an arid land environment. We are not just looking for one species, we're looking for all vertebrate species, every animal with a backbone. And we are getting away from the highways and going more into the rural areas. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So our objectives essentially were to just better understand the when, where, and why of animals using the roads. And in doing that, we're going to document their activity along what's called the wildland-urban interface. This is the transition zone where developed land meets natural places. And by doing this in a science-based construct, we can use the information that we gain to try and effectively inform wildlife conservation management strategies, as well as strategies for transportation managers, the folks that are dealing with roads and structures along roads and so forth. Next slide. So here's some insights of what's been obtained so far. So these data are compiled between 2018 and 2023. And we completed a little bit over 200 surveys and recorded a little bit more than 2,000 animals, both live and dead here. And what this graph shows is that as more traffic, more cars on the road increase along the horizontal x-axis along the bottom, the number of animals we see on the road declines. And the colors of the points just represent roadways that are in three different levels of development, where the red rural areas are sort of the least developed areas, some sparse housing. Connecting in blue relate to roadways that are connector roads. These are not primary highways, but yet important roads to get from A to B. And then lastly, in green, sprawl routes. These are areas that are seeing increased development, more houses, more residential areas coming up, increases in traffic, and so forth. So all in all, once there's about 20 cars per hour on any one of these routes, we start to see an adverse effect. That means roadkill increases, but also the number of animals we see decreases. And if it gets to around 50 cars an hour, we're on average seeing less than one animal. Next slide, please. So relating that to the why some animals are on the road. So we know that environmental factors can contribute to reasons for animals being active and doing the things that they do. So these graphs show a couple of things. So in the left column with the green colored bars relates to the daily minimum temperature. So whatever the minimum temperature for the day around the survey was, how does that relate to roadkill? So for mammals and birds, which we lumped, and reptiles, there's a relationship where as the minimum daily temperature increase, so does roadkill. And the squiggly looking line with the snakes just represents that the relationship is not linear, it's additive. So that means it's kind of fluctuates back and forth until you hit a temperature that's related to the summer. So there's more roadkill in the summer. And then in the right column, it's related to traffic. So with amphibians and reptiles, again, the more traffic there is, the higher the roadkill rates are. Next slide, please. Same thing happens with humidity. On the left with mammals and birds, you have this area where there's higher roadkill at relatively low humidity. Then it sort of dips down. Then you don't really have a roadkill effect in this intermediate zone. Then once it gets an increase in humidity, once again, correlating to the summer monsoon season, there's an uptick in roadkill. And with amphibians and reptiles, again, especially during the summer monsoon season, there is an uptick in mortality for both these animal groups. Next slide. So how do we do this? So we're essentially driving predetermined routes that are about 15 miles or 20 to 30 kilometers, if you will. And we are just looking for any vertebrate animal we see on the road, alive or dead, including off to the road, off to the side of the road. So anything that's sort of in the visual cue. And we're doing this after sunset. So it's dark out. So we can't see super far off the road. So mostly we're looking on the road surface and onto the shoulder and immediately just off the road, scanning back and forth. And surveys can take anywhere between 1 and 3 hours. The 3 hours is pretty rare, but during the summer, after the rains and there's a whole lot of toad reproduction, they tend to go on the road. So there's lots of counting animals there. And when we do find an animal, whether it's alive or dead, we take some data, including the weather and details about the encounters. But also, even though this is a scientific study, it's also really peaceful. Driving through some of these places at night are quite enjoyable. I personally love Ironwood Forest National Monument. I think it's the most serene piece of desert in the world, and it's been really enjoyable to do some of these surveys. Next slide, please. So our coverage is going to be around the greater Tucson area. One of the routes will be near Picacho Peak and just north of Ora Valley, the aforementioned Ireland area. Another route sort of near Saguaro National Park West Unit and Picture Rocks, and also an area near the Colossal Cave and Saguaro National Park East. And we do these surveys about every 2 weeks, give or take, between mid-April and mid-November. And there's a lot of flexibility. So we don't do these surveys during a downpour. So monsoon season is tricky. If you're planning to go out on a Wednesday and it starts to just pour, just cancel and we'll just aim for the next day or thereafter. So there's a lot of flexibility. Next slide. Ever so brief, this is just showing the route in the Picacho Peak to the Pinal Highway, north of Ora Valley. Next slide. This one is going, starts a little bit before and goes through Ironwood Forest National Monument, the Silver Bell route. Next slide. This one is near Saguaro National Park West and Picture Rocks and sort of wraps around that area. Next slide. And finally, this route sort of starts at the north side near the entrance of Saguaro National Park East, sort of winds down and ends around the Colossal Cave area. Next slide. So what is an observation in this sense? So it's any vertebrate animal interacting with a roadway. So quickly recap, vertebrate animals are animals with a backbone. So these are your birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And in this case, an interaction is just an animal that is physically interacting with a road, whether it's on a road itself or on a road adjacent structure, such as a tree, a plant, or even a fencing or a sign that's right adjacent to the road. So for owls that are perched on a saguaro that's right next to the road and we see it while we're driving, yes, that's going to count. If we just saw an owl flying by, it's not going to count. If it's a really cool tarantula or scorpion or something that's fascinating, that's great, but we're not going to count it for this data set. And domestic animals count too. So sometimes we see cattle. Every once in a while, we'll see a dog on the road. We're going to just take some information about that. So as you might imagine, the roadway sort of is both the paved structure of where vehicles drive, including center line, the lane of travel, the road shoulder, but also the edge of the road. And because it's at night and we can't see too far off the edge, that sort of is the boundary of what we're calling the roadway. So it could be just a few feet off the road. And during these surveys, we're only gathering data from what we can see from the car. We're not getting out and chasing after animals into the desert. Next slide, please. So sometimes animals are found alive on the road, and that's great. Actually, we had about 70% of all of our sightings during the first few years of this project were alive on road. So when that's the case, we're going to record the time, the location, we're going to do our best job at keying the individual to species, and we're going to record weather. And when possible, we're going to just estimate the age class, whether it's a baby or an adult of a certain species. And of course, taking pertinent notes and recording pictures for any fascinating or unique observations, or if we're not sure on the species, sometimes there's a couple of species that look really similar and they're hard to tell. We could take pictures and then as a group, we can work on trying to identify them from photos. Next slide. Same thing happens when we come across a dead-on-road animal. So we're going to record everything the same, except we're not going to record weather because we don't know when that animal was struck and killed on the road and what the weather was at that time. So if we took it after the fact, it's not really an accurate representation of what that animal might have been experiencing when it was alive on the road. So we're going to skip weather, but everything else stays about the same for dead on road animals. Next slide. Another thing we're looking at is where in the road animals are found. Now, this only counts for dead on road animals and alive ones that weren't moving. They were just sort of sitting in the road. If an animal was actively moving across the road, we're gonna skip this data point altogether. So when animals are alive but sitting in the road, so for example, sometimes snakes will crawl out into the road and just sort of stay there because they're basking, they're taking up some of the warmth from the road to generate and help with their own body heat, as well as any animal that is dead. And we're looking at where in the road it is to try to determine both behaviors of the animals and to get an idea of human behavior as well. So we look at if animals were in the center line, this is about 1 meter in length on either side of the center line, what we call the tire, which is basically the span of the width of a vehicle where the tires impact the road, aka the travel lane. You've got the shoulder and then beyond the shoulder and the edge. Next slide, please. Same thing applies to dirt roads, but obviously we don't have the center line and any kind of paved markers. So we just have to use our best estimate to figure out what might have been the center, what might have been the travel lane, and so forth. And this is fairly straightforward. There's not much dirt on some of the routes that we do. It's mostly paved, but a few routes do have dirt. Next slide. Okay, so identifying species ID. So we're aiming to be as confident as we can based on the taxonomic hierarchy. And we're only using this off a visual ID. And sometimes it's just a quick glimpse. So we will get animals that are just up ahead of our vehicle and they happen to be moving across the road and we don't have time to take a photo or even get that close sometimes. So we have to use our best judgment. And we start off trying to get to the species level. And if not, we work our way up from there. So a workflow example, and we'll just use this red fox here. So if there's a situation where you're 95% confident that what you saw was the red fox, Vulpes vulpes, you can mark that at the species level. But maybe you didn't get a good glimpse. Like it's dark out, you couldn't see the color of the fur, but you were sure it was a true fox. It might have been a red fox, or maybe it was a kit fox. So it could have been just within the Vulpes genus. So it's okay to just say that it's just a true fox, or it's Vulpes if you happen to know the scientific names. If you weren't sure if it was a fox, maybe it was a juvenile coyote. It was up in the distance, but it was definitely in the canid, the dog family. Then we can just refer to that. And if it was really far away and you didn't get a good glimpse and it was just a second of visual identification, but you're sure it was a carnivore, maybe it was a coyote or could have been a bobcat, then we'd go to carnivore. And if not, we only saw maybe a tuft of fur, so we knew it was a mammal. So the furthest we will go is the class. So I saw something up ahead, I didn't know what it was. It's an unknown mammal. Beyond that, if we don't know if it was a maybe a rabbit versus a frog, you only saw it out of the corner of your eye and it hopped into the shrub and it's out of sight, then we're just gonna skip it altogether. So next slide. And throughout all of this, obviously safety comes first. So we are going to have everyone obey all the safety rules of the roads, so all Arizona motor vehicle laws. And note that these surveys are being done at slower speeds. So you're going to be going no more than 30 miles an hour. Typically 20 miles an hour is better just to be sure you're scanning the roadways accurately. A lot of animals that we're looking for are very small. Um, but you also want to be mindful of oncoming traffic in both directions. So when cars are coming up behind you and they're obviously going much faster than you, it's pretty good to stay alert. We use our emergency flashers to let those drivers know when there's a shoulder. We just pull off to the side and let folks pass safely, and then we just get back to doing what we're doing. When you do see an animal, you don't want to stop in the middle of the road. You want to just look for somewhere that's safe to pull over onto the shoulder where your vehicle is safely out of the transit lane, getting out safely, and then also using flashlights. It's at night, so we want to make sure we are seeing what we're what we're looking for if we need to get out of the car to check on an animal ID, for example. But also using flashlights just to warn oncoming drivers that, hey, you're out of the vehicle, and just to give them a heads up. And of course, we don't risk your own safety for trying to move animals off the road. This is a non-invasive project, which is great. So we don't have to interfere with animals and their activity and what they're doing. Um, so most of what we're doing is just going to be from within the vehicle. Um, but again, yeah, don't try to, risk yourself or anyone else, including traffic, by hurrying up and trying to scoot an animal off the road. So no handling animals, especially venomous species. And Jessica, I believe that's my last slide.
Yeah. And I'll add too that we are going to provide all volunteers with reflective safety vests as well. So you'll have that and any tools you need, including flashlights and that kind of thing too. But we want to definitely highlight the safety aspect of this. All of these projects are under research agreements and permits. So we want to follow those rules and regulations also. I'm just going to throw this in here too. So we have specific studies that we do where we have intended objectives and goals, and they're specifically collecting information that we need for various projects or purposes. In addition to that, we also have iNaturalist, which is a website and smartphone application that you can use to record observations you make in your own time. And we encourage people who decide they don't want to volunteer with us in a more formal way or do this anyway. You have a bike you take frequently or something like that, and you just want to create your own survey routes or just share observations you make anytime, to put them all in here into our iNaturalist project. Our project is called the CSDP Safe Passages Project. You can also join the Roadkill of the Sonoran Desert Project, which is managed jointly by us and Saguaro National Park. That one gathers all points in iNaturalist within Pima County that are labeled dead. So you can automatically be a part of that project just by doing that. And that data is used very differently. There's a lot of biases in terms of where people observe things, but that is something that we definitely encourage folks to do who are interested in sharing this kind of information. So we really want to encourage you to come out and volunteer with us. I will be hosting a in-person training for the folks that reach out to me wanting to volunteer and adopt a transect. So we have 4 transects. We're going to need teams of 4. We need 4 teams essentially to monitor those transects for this season, April through November of this year. And what we're looking for is someone who can drive their own vehicle and someone who can carpool with that individual and help record data. So we'll have a driver and a data recorder in every team. And of course, we can also have additional observers in the vehicle too. But those are the essential team is that the driver and the data recorder. This project we call our Desert Roadies volunteer opportunity. So you'll be a desert roadie, and we have some swag for you coming too. But we hope that volunteers will come help us do this and gather this information that will be super useful for long-term monitoring of these particular areas in comparison to others, and help us build more wildlife crossing structures in the future. I'm going to open it up and see if anyone has any questions. And if not, you can also reach out to me later. I'm available. My contact information is right here. And we'll hope you'll join us. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to stop sharing. if I can do it. It won't let me.
I have a comment to add. Hi, I'm Kayla. I helped Brian out with some of the transect for a couple of years. I just wanted to add that he has really useful data sheets and like how-to guides and species code guides that made it really easy to jump in and take this data in a detailed way. Um, and just that was helpful. It made it easy, and it is really fun. You get to see some cool stuff, and what else are you gonna do on a hot desert night, you know?
Yeah. And you don't have to get up like at the crack of dawn like I did for other surveys that start at sunset, sunrise, right? Um, nice sunsets. Um, thank you. Yeah. So that's what we have. We want to get started with our first survey in mid-April. So we'll be using this month to get all of our volunteers coordinated and trained up and comfortable with doing the task ahead. And please reach out to me if you're interested in doing that or have any other questions forward to. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming. Again, apologies for the confusion at the start. We will have this recording available on our website for you to refer back to later if you need to. And I'm available. Reach out, and I hope to hear from you. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.